Today's topic is what is constraint, how to apply constraints to the table. First of all, we discuss what is a constraint. What are the types of constraints in SQL? What is a constraint? A constraint is a condition which is used to maintain the data in the database is correct. So what is this? A constraint is a condition. A constraint is a condition which is used to maintain the data is correct. So to maintain the data in the database, we know that the data in the database must be correct data. So in order to maintain the correct data in database DBMS, we use the constraints. To maintain correct data in the database, we use constraints in SQL. That is, to maintain correct data in the DBMS, in the database, to maintain correct data in the database, constraints are used. So to maintain correct data in the database. To maintain correct data in the database, we use constraints.
అన్న ఇందాక మార్కెట్ తీసుకెళ్ళండి ఆ 1350 మళ్ళీ ఇద్దాం 1350.
So to maintain correct data, to maintain good quality of data, to maintain good quality of data or to maintain correct data, we use constraints. The constraints in SQL, there are two types of constraints in SQL. They are first one is column constraints. Second one, column constraints. Second one is table constraints. Column constraints. Second one is table constraints. There are two types of constraints in SQL. One is column constraints, another is table constraint. What is a column constraints? What are the column constraints? Column constraints. What is a column constraints or what are the column constraints? These constraints are applied to the columns of a table. The constraints that are applied to the column such a constraint is called as column constraint. The constraints that are applied to a column, such a constraints are called as such a constraints. So we call such a constraints. Constraints are called as column constraints. The different column constraints are So the constraints that are applied to a column, such a constraints we called as column constraints. The constraints that are applied to a column, such a constraint is called as column constraint. The constraints that are applied to a column, that constraints are called as column constraint. The different column constraints are unique constraint, not null constraint, primary key, check constraint, default. These are the column constraints. So we have the column constraints. There are 5 column constraints. One is unique constraint. Second one is not null. Third is primary key. Fourth one is check constraint. 5 is default constraint. So what is unique constraint? Is unique constraint. So what is a unique constraint? What we say that the unique, what is a unique constraint? When this constraint is applied to a column, the column values must be unique. That is, no two rows have the same column value. When this constraint is applied to a column, when this constraint is applied to a column, the column value be unique. When this constraint is applied to a column, then the column value must be unique. That is, so two columns cannot, the columns, that is the column value cannot be repeated. That means the column values must be unique. That means the column values must be unique. That means no two columns has the same, as no two rows at the same column value. That is, no two rows has same column value. So when unique constraint, what is unique constraint? When applied, when we apply this constraint, the column value must be unique. Unique means no two rows have the same column value. For example, if we take a register number, two students cannot have the same register number. So if we given such a value, then the system will produce an error. However, an unique constraint allows null values. So unique constraint. What is unique constraint? When this constraint is applied to a column, so when this constraint is applied to a column, the column value must be unique. So the column values must be unique. So that means what is that unique? Two rows cannot have same column. So when however, an unique constant allows null value. So null value, because value which is not assigned to a variable is called as null value. So two null values. So our unique constant will allows null values. Next you go for not null. So what next you go for not null. So what is a null? A value which is not assigned to a column is called as null value. A value which is not assigned to a column is called as null value. A value which is not assigned to a column A value which is not assigned to a column is called as null value. When you define not null constraint, so the column value cannot be null. When we define not null constraint, then the column value cannot be null. This is called as not null. So this another constraint is not null. So what is not null? So what not null means, when null value means, what is null value? A value which is not assigned to a column, that we call as null value. So when we define not null, the column value, when you define not null constraint, then the column value cannot be null. That's we call as not null constraint. Then we go for primary key. A primary key is a key which is unique and not null. Primary key is a key which is unique and not null. That's we call as primary key. What is a primary? A primary key. A primary key is a key which is unique. The key must be a unique, which is unique and cannot be null. Cannot be not null. So it is a combination of unique and not null is the primary key. So primary key value is a unique. It must be unique and it cannot be a null. So such a key is called as primary key. Check constraint. What is check constraints? So then when we define a constraint, check constraint, the value must satisfy, the column value must satisfy the condition. When we define this constraint, then the column value must satisfy, then the column value must satisfy the condition. For example, if we define marks, suppose I want to define marks. Marks lies between 0 to 100. Then I'll define the check constraint. Check marks greater than or equal to 0 and marks less than or equal to 100. Then the value must be 0 to 100. If the value less than 0, then the system will produce an error. If the value greater than 100, then the system will produce an error. Such a constraint is called as check constraint. Another we have the default constraint. Default constraint. When this constraint is specified, the value is not assigned, then the default value is inserted. When this constraint is specified, then the column, when no value is assigned, then the default value is inserted. This is called as default constraints. These are the column constraints. So what is the constraint? What are the different column constraints? So what is constraint? Then we go for table constraints. This constraint is used establish the relationship between the tables. Table constraint. This constraint is used to establish the relationship between the tables. Foreign key is the table constraint. Foreign key is the table constraint. What is a foreign key? A foreign key is a non-key attribute in one relation and it is a primary key in another relation. A foreign key is a non-key attribute in one relation and it is a primary key in another relation. That's we call as a foreign key. A foreign key is a non-key attribute in one relation and it is a primary key in another relation. So what is a foreign key? A foreign key is a non-key attribute in one relation and it is a primary key in another relation. The value of the foreign key is either or match with the primary key value. The foreign key value must match with the primary. This is called as referential integrity. This is called as referential integrity. Like this, we have the different constraints. First, we go for what is constraint. What are the types of constraints in SQL? A constraint is a condition. So this condition is used to maintain the correct data in the database. So to maintain the data in the database is correct. To maintain the data in the database, to maintain the correct data or to maintain the good quality. Correct data means the data must be very correct. There is no wrong data. In order to avoid such a wrong data in the database, we must use constraints. When you define the constraints during the table creation, then we can maintain the good quality of data. Otherwise, the data in the database may be wrong. So in order to avoid the wrong data, so you must define the constraints during the table creation. So that's we call as a constraint. A constraint is a condition which is used to maintain the data in the database is correct. To maintain the data in the database, to maintain the correct data in the database, we must use constraints. To maintain correct data in the data. There are two types of constraints. One is called as column constraints, another is called as table constraints. So what is column constraints? The constraints that are applied to a column, such a constraints are called as column constraints. So the constraints that are applied to a column, such a constraints are called as column constraints. So there are different column constraints. One is called as unique constraint, not null, primary key, check, default. These are the column constraints. What is a unique constraints? What is the purpose of unique constraints? When you define this constraint, the column value must be unique. That means no two rows have the same column value. Suppose if you give the same number for the two students, then the system will produce an error. For example, if you define register number unique, so no two students cannot have same register number. So that if you try to assign such a number, the system will produce an error. Such a constraint is called as column constraint, unique constraint. So when a unique constraint will allow null values, unique constraints will allow null values. because one null is not equal to another null. That's why unique constraints allows null values. What is null? A value which is not assigned to a column is called as null value. When you define not null constraint, then the value of the column cannot be null. So if you define not null, the user must enter the value. Otherwise, the system will not accept the rows. That's we called as not null. When you define not null constraint, the user must enter the value. Otherwise, the system will not accept the rows. Primary key is the combination of unique and not null. So primary key is a key which is unique and cannot be null. So such we call as primary key. When you define check constraint, when you define this constraint, then the column value must satisfy the condition. When you define check, the value of the column lies with the column where must satisfy the condition. That's we call as check constraints. Default, when you are not assigned a value, then the default value is inserted. That's we called as default constraints. So the primary key is called as entity integrity. So entity integrity, what is entity integrity? This is called as entity integrity. Entity integrity means the primary key value cannot be null. Entity integrity. So this is called as entity integrity. Entity integrity means that is the primary key value. That is the primary key value cannot be null. This we call as default. Then we go for table constraint. What is a table? So what are the tables? So we know that a table is a collection of rows and columns. So this constraint is used to establish the relationship between the two tables. I want to establish the relationship between the two tables. So we must use the table constraints. Foreign key is a table constraint. So we have the table constraints we call as a foreign key. So what is a foreign key? A foreign key is a non-key attribute in one relation and it is a primary key in another relation. So it is a primary key, it's a foreign key is a non-key attribute in one relation and it is a primary key value in another relation. The value of the foreign key is either maybe a null or matched to the primary key. This is called as referential integrity. There are two integrity constraints. One is called as entity integrity, another is called as referential integrity. So entity integrity means primary key value cannot be null. That's called as entity integrity. Another is called as referential integrity. So referential integrity means the value of the foreign key is either it may be null or match with the primary key value. These are the constraints. Before to create any table, you must create a table with the constraints. So then only we can maintain a good quality of data. So that means we are maintaining correct data. Otherwise, we are getting the wrong data. For example, so we are given Ddl statements. So Ddl statements are data definition language. I say that Ddl statements, data definition language. So data definition languages is used to create tables, alter and drop the tables. So we have the create statement, how to create a table. So the function the statement create a table is used to create a tables. This is the syntax: create table, table name, column 1, data type, size, then constraint name, constraint type. You have to define. So if I define like this, create student, suppose this is the student table, student ID, number, student name, character, marks. If I create a table like this, we cannot maintain correct data because we are not given any constraint to any column. Suppose I am a student, his number is 5. I am not defined any constraint. If I am not defined a constraint, so it accepts the duplicate values also. So I am given student name, just varchar of 30. You may or may not given the name, the system will accept. Suppose marks of number 3, so it will accept negative marks as well as positive marks. So that means any type of data it will be accepted. The data is not correct. To maintain such a correct data, we must create tables with constraints. How to create tables with constraints? For example, student. This is the student ID, student name, marks. These are the columns. How to create a table with such a constraint? Suppose this is my table, student is my table. So this student table has 3 columns, student ID, name and marks. How to create a table with that? So how to create a table? For example, create table, table name. So what is the table name? Student. Create table name. What is the table name? Student. Create a table name student ID. So it is the student ID. So number type 3, student ID, number type 3. So this is general declaration. I want to define a constraint. So you have to write a constraint name. First of all, you give the constraint name. Suppose primary key pk under sid. Primary key is primary key pk underscore sid. The primary is a constraint name. What is the constraint? Primary key. Primary key. If I define like this, the student ID cannot be a null and must be a unique. Otherwise, the system will produce an error. If you give the same number, the system will produce. If you are not given a value, then the system will produce an error. The system will not accept such a column. So this under we have the student name, varchar2 of 30 not null. So if I define not null constraint, so if I define not null constraint, so not null constraint. So I define not null constraints. When I define not null constraints, the user must enter the value. Otherwise, it will produce an error. Similarly, so we have the marks. Suppose marks number 3. So you may if you assign the constraint name, that's it's good. So otherwise, it's not. It's better to assign name to a constraint. So check underscore marks. Check marks. So I will give the constraint check marks. Check marks greater than or equal to 0 and marks less than or equal to 100. If I give the constraint like this, the system will produce an error if you are not satisfied, if the value not satisfies. This is the way to create a constraint. So this is the way. So when we create a table like this, create a table student name, student ID number 3, primary key. So please assign a name to the constraint. You have to give the name to a constraint. If you give the given name to a constraint, it is also possible. What is the advantage to assign a name to a constraint means? So it is possible to drop or enable, disable the constraints. If you are not assigned the name to a constraint, it is not possible to drop the constraints or disable, enable the constraints. That's why you better to give the name for a constraint. It's not mandatory, but if you assign the name to a constraint, so it is possible to drop or enable or disable the constraints at any time. If you are not given the name to a constraint, it's not possible. That's why. So you have to give the create table name, student ID number 3, primary key. Suppose I will give the pk underscore sid, primary key. Primary key student ID. What type of the constraint it is? It is a primary key constraint. So when you define a primary key constraint, the value must be unique and it cannot be a null. So another column is name. So name is varchar2 of 30 and not null. So I am define the not null constraint. When I define a not null constraint, the user must enter the value. Otherwise, the system will produce an error. Similarly, marks number 3. So marks is a constraint is of type number 3. So I'll give the constraint name check marks. Ch marks. Check marks. Check marks greater than or equal to 0 and marks less than or equal to 100. That means the value of the marks must be greater than or equal to 0 and less than or equal to 100. So like this, we can create a tables with constraints. Otherwise, we can get the, so this is the good way to create the tables. This is the way to create the tables. Otherwise, we'll get some problems during the program is, so we cannot get the good quality of data. That's why you have to create, in order to create any table, you must maintain a tables. Similarly, there are two tables. Suppose we have the employee table. This is the employee table. I want to create this. So employee table, department table. Suppose we have the two tables, department table and employee table. Suppose first of all, creation of department table. Department table, department ID, department ID, department ID, department name, location. Suppose this is my table. How to create a table with the constraints? I want to create a table with constraints. So how you know that means it depends on the value. So suppose you have to think. Suppose if you take register number, so you must always the register number of the student must be unique. That's why based on that we can use that constraint. Similarly, name. So each student has a name. That's why you have to define not null constraint. Suppose you have the date of birth like this. So we cannot define any constraint, just not null constraint, because your date of birth may be same or different. That's why you cannot give constraint to some columns. So it is not possible. So we have to define what are the important columns of a table. For that columns, you must define a constraint. For some columns, it's not necessary. For some columns, they must be constraints. So depends on the values. So what type of values are, what type of values it may be. So register number. So what type of, it must be unique. So you have to define primary key. Name. So it's a collection of characters. Each student has a name. That's why it is a not null constraint. So it cannot have a unique like this. So marks. Suppose marks, what is the range of the marks? Suppose this is the range of 0 to 100. For example, if you are giving the JEE exams 0 to 360. So are negative marks. So depends. So what are based on that we have to define. For example, this is the department table. I want to create a table. Create table, table name, department, department ID, number 3, department ID number 3. So we have to define primary key, department ID, primary key. This is the constraint. Department name, varchar 2 of 10 not null. Suppose location varchar 2 of 20. So I'm not given any constraint to the location. So the user may or may not enter the constraint. So this is about department. For example, employee. Create, suppose this is another table we have called as employee table. Suppose this is the employee number. So here primary key is the reference foreign key, the department number. So in the employee table, for example, if you take the table, this table employee. So employee table has employee number, employee name, job, manager number, hire date, salary, commission, and department number. So your department number is the non-key attribute, and this department number, so department I will say called department ID or department number, is a primary key in department ID or department number. You give the same or different, no problem. So this department number is here department number is a foreign key. So this it is a non-key attribute in employee table, and a department number is a primary key in department table. This key is called as a foreign key. How to create such a foreign key? So create table name employee number type 3, primary key, employee number, primary key, employee name, char 2 of 30, not null. Next, what is the column? Job, char 2 of 10, job, mgr, number 3, and hire date, or the date type, hire date type, salary, number 7 comma or 8 comma 2, not null. Then commission number 5 comma 2, then department number 3. So these are the different columns. After that, you have to define the constraint. So what is the foreign key constraint? So references. So you have to write like this: department number. After that, references. So references is the we use foreign key references. So what is the references? References department table, department number. So when here department number is a foreign key, this key references department table, department number. So like this we define the foreign key. So you have to write if name you want to define the name. So you have to assign a name also. FK foreign key underscore department, foreign key underscore department, references department number. So like this we can define that this is about foreign key. So like this we can create a tables with constraints. Otherwise we cannot create the tables. Yes, you can use the date for all. For anything you have to give. So date constraints. For date also you can give the constraint, no problem. So here I am given only some columns have the constraints and some columns are without constraints. So some columns there is no restriction on column values, then you cannot give the constraint. If there is any restriction on the column values, then only you can give the constraints. This is the way to create a table. It is better to create a table with constraints. So like this, otherwise, then if you cannot create a table without constraints, you may get the wrong, it accepts the wrong data also. That's the only difference is, so is there any difference of creation of table with the constraints, without constraint means the only difference is if you are creating a table without constraint, the table may or may not have correct data. So while in the case of table with constraints, the table must have a correct data. It must maintain the correct data. That is the only difference. To maintain correct data, then we can use constraints. Otherwise, no. So like this, we can use the constraints. So this is the way to create a table with the constraints. This is about what is a constraint, what are the different constraints. Then we go for alter command. Alter statement. Then we go for alter statement. This statement is used to add column, constraint, modify column, and drop column or constraint. So alter table. What is the purpose of alter table? Alter table is used to add a new column to the existing table, or to add a column to a constraint, to modify a column, or to drop a column, or to drop a constraint. For example, I already created a table without constraints. Now I want to add a constraint to a column table. Then we can use this alter table. Suppose I already created a table, but I missed some column. I want to add a new column. Then we can use alter table. Suppose one column is, I created a table, but one column is not necessary. That column is not necessary. I want to remove that column, or I want to remove a constraint. Then we can use this alter statement. What is alter statement? Alter statement is used to add a column. Suppose there is a table. For the table, I want to add a new column. I want to add a column. So delete add a column or constraint. Suppose I created a table without constraints. Suppose I want to add a constraint to a column. Then I add a column or constraint, modify a column, drop column or constraints. For this purpose, I use alter table. The syntax of alter table is so alter table name, alter table name. The syntax. What is the syntax of alter table? Alter table name. So we have to define add. So to add a column, use add column, or constraints. So you have to add a column. So you write add column. Suppose you want to add a constraint, add constraint. So like this. So similarly, so it is optional. Alter table name. Suppose I want to add a column, add column, then column name data constraint. Suppose add constraint. Suppose I want to add a constraint, add constraint name, and constraint type. So for a column, so you have to add column name and size. Add column name. Add column name type. Suppose I want to add a constraint, add constraint name and type. Constraint type. So you have to add a column or constraint. Similarly, suppose I want to modify column. Which column I want to modify? How to write? Modify column or drop. Suppose I want to drop, delete. Drop means delete. I want to drop a column. We have to write drop column. Drop column or constraint. We use drop column or constraint. This is the syntax for alter table. So what is the syntax? Alter table name. Suppose I want to add a new column to the table. So I use add column name. Suppose I want to add a constraint, then add constraint name and type. Suppose I want to modify a column. Suppose I say given to a varchar of 2, varchar 2 of 10. So I want to 10 to 30. So we give modify column. Suppose I want to delete a column or I want to delete a constraint, then I use drop column or constraint. For example, so this is my table. These are the different tables I already taken. Suppose we have the student ID, student name and marks. Suppose I want to add a mobile number to the student column. Then how can add? For example, we have already table is there. For example, we have already one table is there. So with the columns, suppose to this the student ID, student name. This is my table. Already table is there. So marks. This is the table already existing table is there. I want to add column mobile number. Suppose this is my table already is there. Student table is there. The student table has student ID, student name, and marks. I want to add the mobile number to the student table. During the table creation, I forgot it or I'm not taken so mobile number. But now I want to add a student mobile number. How we can add a mobile number? So then in this case, we use the command alter table. So table name is what is table name student. Then add column. So this is the column. That's way add column. So what is the column type? Number. How many digits? It's 10 digits. Then the table is altered. So then the new table is created with mobile number. Sorry, add column mobile number. Add column mobile underscore number, mobile number type of 10. So if we create a new table, then the table is like this. The new table is student ID, student name, marks, and mobile underscore number. So this is the way to add a new column. So suppose I want to add this column, so we can simply add the column. So like this. Suppose I want to add a constraint, so we can add it, no problem. Suppose I want to use the table I created. Suppose I'm not given any constraint to the mobile number. Suppose I want to add a constraint to the mobile number. Then we can add the constraint, right? A mobile number, suppose alter table name student, add constraint. So what is the constraint? Suppose it's not null. Suppose I want to define not null. So not null of, so like this, add constraint, constraint name. So you have to give constraint name or something or column. Then we have to give the column name. So then what column we have to give the column. So we can like this, we can create a table with constraint. This is the way to create alter table. So later we discuss, tomorrow we'll discuss remaining how to add a constraint, how to modify a constraint, how to drop a column, how to drop the constraints. Tomorrow we'll discuss again. So this is about today's class.